Hello and welcome to the 8th and final episode of Facts, Values, and Flourishing. I'm Craig Biddle. Today I want to do a quick recap of the main points that we've covered in the first 7 episodes of this series. And then I want to talk briefly about some of the vital implications on a personal level, social level, and a political level. So we began this series with an observation of the fact that there's a big conflict between the goal of pursuing your values and making your life the very best it can be. And there's this huge industry, the self-help industry, that's dedicated to helping people do this. But that goal is in conflict with traditional morality, with the idea that being moral consists in self-sacrificially serving others. And we observed that if you hold the premise that being moral consists in selflessly serving others, and you still aim to make your life the best it can be, one of two things is going to happen. You're either going to feel guilty about pursuing your values because you're not then sacrificing for others and being moral, or you're going to back off on that pursuit to some extent to assuage your moral guilt and feel like you're being moral. And there's no getting around this. If you truly believe that being moral consists in self-sacrificially serving others, there's no way that you're going to be able to pursue your values 100% to make your life the best it can be without feeling guilty for not being sacrificial. So we then set ourselves the project of trying to see whether we can find a morality that, instead of undermining and conflicting with that goal, actually undergirds and supports it. So altruism conflicts with this goal and undermines it, and we want to find a morality, or see if a morality exists, that actually undergirds and supports this goal of making your life the best that it can be. So we then quickly ran into this thing called the is-ought dichotomy, or the fact-value dichotomy. And this is the notion that you cannot derive values from facts. You cannot derive moral principles about how people ought to act, from the facts of reality, from what is. And this is a pervasive idea in the culture. It's very pervasive among various philosophers. But it's also commonly accepted by most people on some level, even if they don't think of it in terms of the is-ought dichotomy or the fact-value dichotomy. You can see it in things like the claim that if there is no God, anything goes, right? And the idea here is you can't get morality from observation and logic. The only place you can get morality from is from revelation and faith, from religion, right? And so this is why religion has a monopoly on morality, because people accept this idea that you can't derive moral principles from observation and logic. The only place you can get it from is religion, revelation, and faith. Well, this exacerbates the problem, because the morality that comes from religion is never use your mind to make your life the very best it can be, pursue your values, don't sacrifice, make your life just a big flourishing fest. It's never that. It's always sacrifice for the poor, sacrifice for your neighbor, sacrifice for God, sacrifice, right? That's the moral code that you get from any religion. It's going to say that the essence of being moral is self-sacrificially serving others. I mean, this is why the image of Jesus on the cross is such a powerful image for Christianity, because Jesus, the most moral man, was most moral. Why? Because he sacrificed the most. And that's why Mother Teresa is regarded as a paragon of virtue, and so on. So the problem gets worse when we realize that it appears we can't derive moral principles from the facts of reality, because then we're going to have to default, or it seems that we're going to have to default, to the morality that gets foisted on people from religion. So we want to determine whether we can find a moral code that isn't that way, and we want to see if we can figure out or derive that moral code from the facts of reality. So then we turn to the work of the philosopher Ein Rand. And Rand has a very different approach to morality than anyone prior to her. Instead of looking out at the world and saying, well, what moral codes are already in existence and which ones should we choose? Or instead of saying, well, okay, let's take altruism and see if we can support that with observation and logic, Rand stepped back and said, well, wait a minute. Do we need morality at all? What is morality, and why does man need it? Either we need it or we don't. And if we don't need it, then we don't need it. We can just throw it away and get on with our lives. But if we do need it, then the reason why we need it is going to shed a lot of light on which morality is the proper one. Rand then observed that morality is a code of values to guide man's choices and actions, right? So if that's the case, and this is true of all moral codes, regardless of whether they're egoistic or altruistic or anything else, it's a code of values to guide your choices and actions. Well, what's the central concept there? It's value. So Rand homes in on that, gets more specific. What are values and why does man need them? And by pursuing an answer to these questions and by using observation and logic to get there, we observed how Rand got down to the very fundamental issues in morality and realized that values are objects of actions taken by living organisms to achieve the things that they need in order to remain in existence. So values exist because living organisms exist, and living organisms pursue values in order to remain in existence. This is sort of at the base of what Rand discovered. And the easiest way to remember this is you can pursue values only because you're alive, and in order to remain alive, you must pursue values, right? Those are just facts. And by observing this, and this is just a quick summary of what we saw there's a lot more to it, but the point is that values are based on facts. They're based on and derived from the factual requirements of life. And the life of any given living organism and the requirements of that organism's life set the standard of value for that organism. So for human beings, the requirements of human life, given the kind of animal that we are, sets the requirements, sets the factual values for us. And given that we are extremely complicated, complex beings, we're beings of body and mind, matter and spirit, and we have long-term needs. We live not for a moment or a day, but for years and decades. We have to take all of this into account in determining what values are proper for human beings. We then moved on and we saw that indeed there are factual values, for instance, very fundamental values such as reason and purpose and self-esteem that are absolutely fundamental to human life. We cannot live if we don't observe reality, use reason, figure out the nature of things, and use that knowledge to support our life. We cannot live if we don't set goals and go after those goals, if we don't have purposes. We cannot function properly if we don't have self-esteem, the conviction that we're able to live, we're able to deal with the world, and that we're worthy of success in the world, and so on. We then saw that there's a hierarchy of values in human life. There are fundamental values, values that are absolute requirements of human life. And then there are optional values, such as your choice of career and your choice of friends and various things. And there's a range within which those optional values are valid. If you get outside of the range, and robbing banks for a living is not a viable choice. Why? Because it's contrary to the requirements of human life, and so on. So we saw, by means of these observations and integrations, that morality is indeed a science. There are factual requirements, there's a hierarchy of values, and because there's a hierarchy, there's even a measurement system by which we can determine whether or not a choice or action is good or bad. Because the question is, does it support and advance your life, or does it harm and destroy your life, given the kind of animal that you are? So we call that the math of egoism, the math of morality, if you will. We also saw the relationship between values, which are objects of actions, and virtues, which are actions taken toward an object. So we looked at some virtues such as rationality and productiveness and honesty and independence and justice. I think we only looked at a few of those, but we saw that there are principles and then there are actions based on those principles, and those principled actions are virtues. Principled life-serving actions are virtues. So again, we saw further that there's a real science to this. There are factual values, there are factual requirements of life in terms of action, and those are the legitimate virtues of human life. And we started to see that there really is a fact-based moral code that's ultimately grounded in the requirements of human life, which are grounded in observation and logic, just facts that we can see. We saw that Rand summarizes her moral code with the Spanish proverb, God said, take what you want and pay for it. The God said part means reality dictates. Rand was an atheist, so what she means by this is just metaphoric. Reality is a certain way, and it dictates something. What does it dictate? That if you want something, you have to take the actions to get that thing. We live in a causal environment. So you have reality says, if you want these things, then you must act this way. And we observe that the things that you want, the things you're going after, are your values, and the actions that you take toward them are the virtues. So that's the relationship of reality and values and virtues. We then moved on and saw that once you are operating on this framework, self-help becomes much more awesome, because it's now grounded in morality. It's now a moral fact that you know to be true, that you should make your life the best that it can be. You should pursue your values and not sacrifice them. And in knowing that, you can get very philosophic about the kind of self-help that you embrace and that you employ in your life. And different things work for different people, but you can come up with standing orders that help you to pursue your values and make your life great. You can figure out which systems, whether it's Tim Ferriss or Carnegie or Covey or whoever, whose ideas, and maybe you cherry pick from some of them. But anyway, when you're using principles of self-help to make your life great, you now have moral fervor behind that. It's not just, oh, I'm doing this. It's, I should be doing this. This is exactly what I should be doing. I should be making my life great. And you have no tendency to feel like, oh, I'm not sacrificing for others, I'm not being moral, because you now know that being moral consists in pursuing your values, not in giving them up. So we discovered that there is indeed a moral code that supports the pursuit of your values and the goal of flourishing. It's called rational egoism. It's the morality discovered by and developed by Ein Rand. And it's a beautiful thing. It enables us to know that we are that our pursuit of values is moral and good, and that we should do it in a 100% consistent manner. We should do it without any sacrifice, and so that's the essence of the main connection that we made. So we discovered that there is this moral code, and it integrates with, undergirds, and supports the aim of flourishing rather than conflicting with and undermining that aim. So the big integration here is that you don't have to have a dichotomy between flourishing and morality. Morality, properly understood, an observation-based logical morality, one based in the biological and psychological needs of human beings, the kinds of animals that we are, that morality supports the aim of flourishing. And so I urge you to read more about this morality. Read Ayn Rand's book, The Virtue of Selfishness. Read my book, Loving Life, The Morality of Self-Interest and the Facts that Support It. Come to understand these ideas really well and to own them. Don't accept any ideas that don't make sense to you. That would be the most selfless thing you could do. Don't do that. Ayn Rand would never recommend that, and I certainly don't either. But if the ideas make sense to you, you can embrace this moral code that actually supports your goal of making your life the best it can be. And that's a beautiful thing. So now I want to talk about, just real quickly, the personal, social, and political implications of this. The personal implications we've already touched on to some extent. If you understand these ideas, take them seriously, and uphold them, you now have you have moral fire behind your pursuit of a life of flourishing. That's great. And you also have the fundamental principles that will help you to do that, and fundamental principles that will also help you to determine whether any other principles are proper. So if there's some principle that you read about in a self-help book that says something like, some of them do too, they'll say, you should sacrifice 10% of your time for other people or whatever. Well, okay, where did that come from? Is that true? are there any facts that give rise to it? Is it anchored in the facts and principles of observation-based morality, or is that just some remnant that's being brought into this discussion from religion or from altruism, right? So once you have your head around these moral ideas, you can also filter out the ideas that contradict them, the ideas that contradict the idea that life is the standard of value and that reason is your basic means of living and your only means of knowledge, and so on. So on a personal level, what this does for you is it really enables you to make your life the very best it can be. On a social level, what this does is it helps you to realize that sacrifice, whether the sacrifice of others to you or whether the sacrifice of yourself to others, is wrong. Human beings don't need to sacrifice for each other. What we need is to live in harmony with each other. We need to uphold the principle of non-sacrifice, the idea that no one should sacrifice anything. What everyone should do instead is identify the values that they need in order to make their lives great, pursue those values by keeping in mind their hierarchy of values and never sacrificing a greater value for the sake of a lesser value, and then work voluntarily with each other on projects that you want to work with other people on. And if you don't want to work with someone on something, then don't. So all human interaction should be voluntary, and it should be based on the trader principle, the idea that that everyone involved is getting more out of the process than he's putting in. So that's what a trade is. And trades can be made on the financial level or the economic level, and they can be made on the spiritual level, the psychological level. So friendships are kinds of trades. You get something from your friend, he gets something from you. Romance is a kind of a trade. You get a lot from your lover gets a lot from you. Everyone gains in these relationships. These are not sacrifices, they're gain-gain relationships, they're win-win relationships. And once we understand that human life is the standard of moral value, and once we embrace that fully and we eliminate the idea that sacrifice is good, we can all live in perfect harmony to the extent that everyone is willing to do that. Now, some people are not, and that brings us to the political issue. Because on this framework that we've looked at, because it's a fact that everyone morally ought to pursue his life-serving values and morally ought not to sacrifice, it's also a fact that people ought to be left free to pursue their life-serving values, and therefore no one has a moral right to interfere with your pursuit of your life-serving values. And this is what gives rise to the principle of individual rights, which I mentioned briefly in one of our earlier episodes. The principle of egoism says that each person should pursue his own life-serving values and is the proper beneficiary of the values that he produces or creates in life. And the principle of rights basically takes that principle up to the political level and serves as a bridge from ethics to politics. And it says, yes, because it's true that each person should pursue his values and act in a non-sacrificial manner, each person must be free to pursue his values and act in a non-sacrificial manner. Now, if somebody wants to sacrifice, that's his business. But no one has a right to force anyone to sacrifice. No one has any right to force a person to act against his judgment. This is the principle of individual rights, and it supports a proper government, ultimately. Now, I'm not going to get into a big song and dance about government, but the point is that once you have your head around the principle of individual rights, and you know that it's derived from a factual moral base, which is grounded ultimately in the biological requirements of human life, we have a huge fact-based scientific structure that supports the idea that the only proper purpose of government is to ensure that human beings do not use physical force, do not initiate physical force against each other. So the proper purpose of government on this principle, on this philosophy, on this structure, is to protect individual rights by banning the use of initiatory physical force. And a proper government does one thing. It protects rights by banning physical force from social relationships, and it uses force only in retaliation and only against those who initiate its use. So all of this is implied by this idea of a scientific, fact-based morality that's in support of human life and flourishing instead of in conflict with it. So we've got personal good comes from it, social good comes from it, political good comes from it. To read more about the political implications of these ideas, read Ein Rand's book, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. And you can also visit the website of the Objective Standard, and we have lots of articles about individual rights and politics and government there. So I urge you to take a look at that if you're not familiar with that material. But that's about it. That's what I wanted to say today. I wanted to remind us where we came from with this in this series and how we built this structure on the basis of observation and logic. We can now see that there is a fact-based morality and that it's actually supportive of your aim of making your life the best it can be. It's also supportive of social harmony on the principle that everyone should pursue his values and not sacrifice, and everyone has a right to pursue his values and no one has a right to use physical force against other people, and that even gives rise to a proper government. So I hope you've enjoyed this series. I've certainly enjoyed the time that I've put into this, and I've gotten some good feedback on it. If you have friends who are unaware of this and you think they might get something out of it, please share these episodes. They're going to be available both on Facebook and on YouTube. We'll eventually put them together in a podcast format also, so you'll be able to download them that way. So share these links. I'll probably be announcing another series in the very near future, and so keep your eye out for that. You can join our mailing list at theobjectivestandard.com and stay on top of any future video series or podcasts that we'll be releasing. Also our conferences, TOSCon and the journal, and various projects that we have in the hopper. So please check that out and get on the list. And until next time, love your life.